as opposed to simply just start always looking for new criminals. Prisoner reentry is, I guess you could look at it, Newton's law of physics. What goes up must come down, and for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. 95% of the people who are over 95% who are incarcerated are released back into the community. Many of them serve a life sentence, 30 days at a time, 6 months at a time. And what reentry, the concept of reentry attempts to do is using valid and reliable assessment tools, needs, and risks to bring the community resources in at the point prior to release to help improve the outcome upon release. 4.5 years ago, the Department of Corrections contracted with Dennis Schrantz. Dennis retired from the Michigan Department of Corrections. He was the assistant director. He was the #2 person in corrections. And he is now the director of the Center for Innovative Justice. And they contracted with Dennis to come and work with them to analyze prison populations, offenders, and reentry initiatives, and to try to replicate what he was able to do in the state of Michigan, which was to reduce prison populations and recidivism and save money at the same time. And he will tell you in a couple of minutes, but there are 5 parishes in the state that account for 40% of all of the prisoners in Louisiana. So the emphasis has been on those 5 parishes. Part of the analytical data that they did showed them put your money where the biggest problem is. And the next 7 areas represent the next highest amount of prisoner population. The Lafourche, Terrebonne region is in that second set, in the next 7, so in the top 12. And so each area, each section forms community coalitions. And within those community coalitions, the coalitions are made up of stakeholders, not just criminal justice professionals, but faith-based and advocacy groups and mental health and on and on and on. And Dennis will talk about that. That coalition comes together to help identify the resources and set the priorities on the reentry initiatives. And then within the coalition, you have a steering team. And those are the subset or the smaller group that really rolls their sleeves up, and they're in the trenches and get the work done. Most of you from Terrebonne are coming to this initial introductory meeting. A similar meeting was held here about a month and a half ago for people in Lafourche, the stakeholders in Lafourche. They have been invited to join us at 2 o'clock or 2:15, so Dennis can take us into the second part. So really it's a 2-part process. He wants to take all of you that have never sat through this presentation to get a good conceptual understanding of what LA-PRI, or Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Initiative, is about. And then you'll have the same information the people from Lafourche had, and then the 2 groups together will combine. And the hope is that Lafourche and Terrebonne can put together a coalition and ultimately a steering team. So without cutting into his time any further, I'm going to let Dennis jump in and take you from, let you know what he's done and how this process works, and answer any questions that you might have.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? So, you know, this isn't real complicated stuff when it boils all down. How many folks here would like to know what citizens from this particular community are in prison, if you just show me your hands? Who do you want to know who's in prison from the community? How many folks here want to know when they're getting out of prison? And for those of you who want to know when they're getting out, do you want them to have a plan when they get out, or do you want them not to have a plan? You are supporters of the Louisiana Prisoner Reentry Initiative, because that's what it all boils down to. Is we want to make certain we know who's in prison, we know when they're getting out, we know what risks they pose to the community, we know what type of needs they have, that if we don't address their needs, we're not going to be able to see them succeed upon release. And we want to know at what rate they're getting out, at what pace they're getting out, how many a month. We want to work with them before they get out to make sure they have a plan before they get out. If they don't have a place to live and they don't have a job, I don't think the time we want to find that out is when they hit the street. Then they're in the homeless shelter. They got a bad addiction problem. We don't want to find that out 2 days after they get out. We're going to find them in the emergency room. And we're going to be spending all sorts of money doing stuff to catch up. When if we would just done a better plan beforehand, we would have been more effective. Everything we talk about today centers on that simple process of identification of these guys, men and women, before they get out and working with a plan. Now, there's organizational structures, there's committees that have to be formed, there's work that needs to be done, but at the end of the day, it's all about individualized reentry plans. Now, we can't treat everybody who gets out of prison like they're the same person. Everybody's not the same. What we care about is the degree to which they're more likely to fail. We want to work with the people that are more likely to fail, not the people that are less likely to fail, even though it's a lot easier to work with the people who are less likely to fail. If we got people knocking on our human service agency door, motivated, wanting to do the work, show up, dress nice, polite, ready to go to work, yes ma'am, no ma'am, odds are it may be the wrong person. Maybe not. But the ones we got to be concerned about are the ones that don't show up at our door, the ones that are non-compliant, the ones that got bad attitudes, the ones who've been in and out, in and out, in and out, the ones who just as soon stay away from us. Those are the ones we have to target. If we wait till they get out to try to figure out who they are, it's already too late. They're already out in the street on shaky legs. And so what we have to do is we got to identify them before they get out of prison. And we got to make sure that before they get out, we have access to them. The folks that are the highest likelihood of failure are the ones that we work with the Department of Corrections with to move them into a local facility months before they're released, so that we get to interact with them and do whatever training and programming we can do with them and get those types of assessments on their risk and on their need done so we know who we're dealing with. And that's the way that we will reduce recidivism, meaning reconviction, new violations post-release, revocations, and return to prison. So that's at the heart of everything we're going to be talking about today. Does that make sense to folks here, what I've said so far? There's nothing particularly controversial about this, by the way. And I'll say this up front. You know, we just went through a legislative fiat, which I call it, where they tinkered with the sentencing laws, and they said, you know, there's from now on, people that are committed a certain kind of crime and convicted, they're going to do less time in prison. And then they said, well, let's look backwards and let's apply it retroactively so that those of them that are in prison convicted of that crime, their length of time is reduced, and we ended up having to let them out early. How many folks are familiar with the early releases under justice reinvestment? Raise your hand. Every law enforcement officer in the room raises his hand high. This is a legislative fiat. There's no planning with that. This is not that. This is taking advantage of what we already do in the state with the Department of Corrections, with our partners in the sheriff's offices, in the parish jails that are housing. Half of the state prisoners are housed in parish jails. That's the partnership that we take advantage of. And we identify mostly men, but we identify the men and the women who are most likely to come back to prison, make sure they're in a local facility, and do this plan. The work of a large group of people, a coalition, is to learn about this, like we're doing today, and to learn enough about it that you can teach others. Your job as a coalition is to learn and educate. Now, when we join forces, most of the folks here are from Terrebonne, as I understand it, when we join forces later this afternoon with the folks that already had the pleasure of this first presentation here, we're going to have what looks like a two-parish coalition, be about 60, 70 people. That group, two things, learn and teach. Break down the myths, make sure we're clear. Why does this make sense to us, right? You want a plane, you don't want a plane, you want to know who's coming back, all that. From that larger group, we get a group of volunteers about 15 strong. They become the steering team. So they represent the full group, but there's 15 strong, and we got some detail about what that looks like. We're going to cover that a little later. So what you see up on the screen there just gives you a little bit of background. Our vision for this thing is when people get out of prison, they got the tools and resources they need to succeed. Our mission is to do that with them one at a time, particularly the ones that are higher likelihood of failure. Big focus on jobs, and we don't have enough of them. We got to make sure that the men, particularly the men and the women who are getting out of prison, are more attractive as potential employees, because when we have them before release, we're teaching them the soft skills they need to know to be able to show up for work on time, not do drugs, and help employers understand that these folks can be good, loyal, dedicated employees and try to match them up. Big focus on housing, big focus on education, and of course, big focus on behavioral health, mental health, and substance abuse. We've enjoyed some funding from philanthropies. We've gotten some state funding. There's more state funding that we hope to get. And in order for some of that state funding and federal funding and philanthropic funding to get into this community, we have to formalize a formal coalition, adopt the framework, the Louisiana Prisoner ReEntry Initiative, form up the steering team, understand the policies and the processes. How is this supposed to work? Form up committees to help with education and housing. Formalize, take advantage of the documentation that we've created that is essential to be able to raise dollars from the feds, from the state, from the philanthropies. And we do that not only as a group in the communities, but we do that linked, arm in arm, with all the other parishes that are in the same boat we are. We're forming up something called the Louisiana Prisoner ReEntry Initiative, LA-PRI, Steering Team Association. That's a long name. We'll call it LA-PRI. And Bonnie Hawkins is here today. She's received a grant from the Wilson Foundation, one of our big supporters. And with that, we're going to make certain that every time a parish comes into the fold, that you can network and link with the other parishes. There are 5 in that first tier. Sheriff mentioned 40% of all the people come from and then return to 5 parishes: Caddo, East Baton Rouge, Jefferson, Orleans, St. Tammany. Those 5, and then the next 8 represent the next 30%. Rapides, Calcasieu, Ouachita, Lafayette, Terrebonne, Lafourche, Livingston. And yes, it's true, you just heard a Yankee pronounce all those parishes pretty well. Pretty well. Ouachita was a tough one for me. Ouachita is what I first called it. They threw me out of town. But the next round of 7 parishes, they're equally as important, because look, if 5 parishes represent 40%, and the next 7 or 8 parishes represent 30%, well, you got to pay attention to it all. Know that that means that when you're working with 12, 13 parishes across the state, you've hit 70% of the people that are coming back. And we don't want to ignore the other, the 64 parishes. We don't want to ignore them, but we got to start with where the numbers are. So this association will be able to help everyone learn more, help us apply for the dollars that we need to be able to do the work. And Bonnie's filming this today so that we can train more people to do this kind of presentation that I do. Go ahead, you do it at some point. I'm going to look forward to that. That's going to be fun. So that's kind of the beginning of what I want to talk about here so far. So, you've heard this phrase before. If you haven't heard this phrase before, give me a show of hands. Evidence-based practices. You heard this? A lot of people saying this, evidence-based evidence. What's it mean? It means it's research-driven. It means that somebody studied it, and on this work they found that if you do this kind of stuff, you will reduce the likelihood of not only individuals coming out of prison and committing new crimes, but if a community bands together to do the type of work that we do here, then you can reduce the target, you can reduce the recidivism rate of the entire target population. You do that, of course, one person at a time, but when you form up a coalition and a steering team, you're looking at hundreds of people, and that means you've got to have a systematic approach. Evidence-based practices simply means we're doing that based on what research tells us work. If the research tells us it doesn't work, we ain't going to do it. If the research tells us it's work, we're going to do our best to be able to do it. This is a picture of what those evidence-based practices are. I've talked about a couple more already. Risk and need, and the ability to understand the difference. Now we'll look at this room here, and we'll divide it up pretty simple. And our friends over here in the uniform are going to love the way I do this. This is our lowest risk folks over here. Yeah, I've heard about you. I don't necessarily believe it. This is the low-risk group. This is the moderate risk group. And the reason it's so big is because that's what defines moderate. They're in the middle. And over here we got the high risk. From the low end of the high risk all the way up to the high end of the high risk. When we're thinking about all these people, all y'all coming back from prison, who are the ones we need to be concerned about most? This group over here? But who do we like to serve? Well, look at these guys, so polite, showing up, bringing apples in, yes sir, yes ma'am. And then over here, this group over here, they're moderate risk, maybe they got more needs, but they kind of tend over this way. This is where we need to start working, moderate to high, and then over here, but I'll tell you what about these guys up here, and I'm going to put you down here, and then put you in the very high end. These are not the people we're going to get a lot of traction from. Very high risk of return, very high need, and way in the back there, and excuse me ladies, I don't take this personal, is where we got our sociopaths and our psychopaths. And you have no idea how many times I say that, people say, yeah, that's me. But that's what we have to understand. That's what evidence-based practices say is know who's coming back. Understand their risk level and their needs. So think about these risk levels. Here's our sweet spot. Moderate, the high end, moderate. These folks over here, what do I want to know about that group? I want to know which ones have more needs and which ones have fewer needs. If our friends down here have got fewer needs, we don't have to do so much with them. We move up the crowd here. They got higher needs. These are the ones we need to be concerned about. That's differentiating the people that are coming back into groups so you can be more effective. And we do that in a way that engages the community through these councils and through these steering teams and through these committees. And what we have to understand is what is already going on in the community that works. We have assets. This isn't anything new in this community. Y'all been doing reentry for a long time. When I look at your failure rates, your recidivism rates, switch that around and look at your success rates, better than half the people get out of prison or staying out of prison. That doesn't come as just happens. That happens because y'all are working with it. We want to improve that a bit. So what are the assets that you have, particularly around housing, education, employment, etc.? How do we take those assets and make sure that we're not leaving them out there, opening the door for all these folks to fill them up, knocking on our door, they want the services, they deserve it, they're likely to succeed. When you hear that stuff, you're creaming. You're not working with the ones over here. These over here, not so much these guys down here, but these guys up here, and these three here. Sheriff, I got you in the wrong group again. These three over here, man, oh man, you look at their record, we don't think they deserve it. We're not sure they're going to be successful. That's the ones that we got to target. That means we got to make sure that we're engaging the community so they understand what we're talking about here, and also understand that we want to measure what we're doing with folks. How many of them are getting plans? How many of them are getting jobs? How many of them in sustainable, affordable housing? A little bit better every year, right? So those are the evidence-based practices. And when we're working with people, understand that we have to give them positive reinforcement. So we're looking at this group over here, kind of our sweet spot, right here. Got these guys coming in our office. We got some parole officers here. People working, yeah, we go.
3 o'clock.
Oh, 3 o'clock, that's right. Well, y'all working in the sheriff's department, you're interacting with clients all the time, right? People in jail. So when you go up to someone and you start kind of ragging them about the bad stuff that they've been doing, what happens? You know, they shut down, they don't listen. You got to have positive reinforcement. You got to understand what folks are doing well, and you got to have a ratio of positive reinforcement. You got to be able to talk about that. That's what these evidence-based practices are in a nutshell. And this shows that when you apply them, you can reduce the return to prison rate by double digits. When we did this work in Michigan, we improved the success rate by 36%. Instead of 1 out of every 2 of this group going back to prison, we whittled it down to 1 out of every 3. We never promised we were going to eliminate crime, and we didn't, but we promised we would reduce it. Evidence-based practices are proven to work, and it always gets down to this individualized planning that you do. This is a picture of what the model looks like, the LA-PRI framework in a nutshell. We understand there's 3 phases. People are in prison, getting ready to get out. People are at that pre-release stage. For the people that are higher likely to recidivate, we want to be working with them 3 to 6 months in advance in a local facility. And then they get released and they're in the community under supervision. Those are the 3 phases. In each of that phase, we have to have a transition plan, a transition accountability plan, or a TAP. Here in this state, we call it the REAP, the ReEntry Accountability Plan. And that's what we do. So if we change the makeup of this crowd here, and we say, all right, these folks are in prison, these folks are in pre-release, these folks are in the community, at all 3 stages of this work, we got to know their risk level, their needs. We got to use that to make decisions about their programming, about how much attention we need to give them. We got to help them create this reentry plan that by the time they get out, they're on strong legs. The time that we got to get this plan done is when they're still in prison before they get over here. Because once they're out here, they're unprotected. When they're still locked up, there's limitations to what they have access to. Severe limitations. But when we let them out, they go right back to the communities that they came from, the neighborhoods they came from. And those pressures are great. So we better get the stuff lined up here so we know what they're doing 2 minutes after release, 2 hours after release, 2 days after release, 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 by 2 by 2 by 2. If we can do that with this crowd here, the moderate and the higher risk, we're going to see success. We're going to see fewer of them go back to prison. We're going to see more of them ending up being able to succeed in the community. This is the way it flows. We look at them while they're locked up in prison. We do assessment, classification, need to know risk levels, where we're going to house them. They get some programming when they're in a state prison. If they're in a jail, a parish jail as a state prisoner, they very well may not be getting any programming. Sheriffs in the state have stepped up to the plate here when the state ran out of prison beds years and years ago and said, look, we'll take them and we'll house them. They get like $24.39 a day, and that's just barely enough money to feed them and give them a place to sleep. But that price tag ends up to be $172 million a year. We're not paying the sheriffs to do programming. It's twice as much money if they're going to do the program. But the reality is then that we've got half of the people in prison housed in parish jails scattered across 64 different parish, well, 63, because Orleans jail didn't take them anymore. And they're not getting the programming that the state prisoners get. You got 18,000 people locked up in state prison facilities, 18,000 people locked up in parish jails. It's 50-50. But of the people who get out of prison, who are done with their prison term, 75% of that 14,000 releases every year are coming out of those parish jails, not out of the state prison. So by making certain that we identify the moderate to highs and make sure that they're moved locally here, we're probably going to give them the first programming that they've ever got. Although, frankly, some sheriffs have really stepped up to the plate and added some programs to their jails, but it's a bit spotty. And so that's the way that this flows. Release preparation. If the Department of Corrections or the parole board for some of the cases involved in the release decision, and that happens before they get here, they give them conditions of release, etc. We take that into account, and before they get out, we start to do this plan. Make sense so far? Yeah. Anything not make sense? Does anything sound like crazy talk? Don't be shy. You can say I sound crazy. All right. So when you look at that model, that three-phase model, and you dig into it deeper, like what we've done in the Center for Justice Innovation for the past 10 years, we've dug deeper and deeper and deeper. We can give you a whole lot of information about what we really should be looking at in each of these phases. This is way in the weeds here, but I just want you to see that this thing goes deeper than that first slide I showed you just a moment ago. Understanding, working with potential employers, family reunification, transportation, these are all issues. It's taken us a long time to get into this mess. It's going to take us a long time to get out of it. This is not a short-term fix. This is continual from this point forward. We're going to do better with some of these moderate and high risk. We're not going to do better with all of them. We improve at 10, 15%, 20%. That means 5, 6 fewer going back every month. That's a pretty big deal. So that's the model. As we go through the year, more of this will become clear as we move on. I talked about risk and need. I want to talk a little bit about structures. So the sheriff said, and by the way, the sheriff is very, very smart about this stuff, and I don't say that to all sheriffs. He really does get it very well. We've had some meetings over in Terrebonne. It's very impressive, the folks over there as well. And it's really important to recognize that this community's been doing this a long time, and we're not coming in saying everything's going to be new. It's not. But we have a state structure, we have a local structure. I'm going to talk about the state structure first. It's up on the screen. Under the statute, we have something called the ReEntry Advisory Council. You can't see the top of the screen there. That's what it says at the top. ReEntry Advisory Council. Goes by the acronym the RAC. Not sure if that was intended to be funny or not, but it's the RAC. And what we've done under the LA-PRI is we have formed up an implementation team at the state level. We've got the strong support of the governor. And when the governor says he supports it, that means his cabinet supports it. That means when you look at the representatives you have here for employment, housing, healthcare, etc., it's people at the top of those state agencies. And they're bringing resources to the table. They're helping us think about it and plan it. And as we start to launch this thing, because we've been planning it for years, we're about to start launching it in 2018. It's going to be very valuable to have those people at the table because they're the ones that are controlling the money. They're also controlling the policies and the rules about who can get services. Anybody with a felony conviction can't get into any type of public housing. Really? Who says so? The state points to the feds. It's not true. Feds don't say that. The feds say, you ever been convicted of selling drugs in public housing, you can't be in public housing. It doesn't say you can't be convicted of a felony. But that's how the rules go. So you got to have people at the state level at the table helping you think about this stuff. You see up on the screen there, among other things, a lot of Department of Corrections people, and I worked with the Department of Corrections behind closed doors for 2 years. For 2 years to make sure that this model worked for them. And I've never had, in the 12 states I've worked over the past decade, I've never had a group that was smarter, more dedicated, and got this any better than this group did. And I've never had a group that showed up quarter after quarter after quarter for 8 different meetings over the course of 2 years, and barely one of them missed a meeting. And I've never had the situation where the head of the Department of Corrections, in this case Secretary Jimmy LeBlanc, came to every meeting, and unless he was pulled out of the meeting, stayed for all the meetings. And you'll hear Secretary LeBlanc, he's talked about a lot of this stuff, and he's really smart on it, and he's at the tail end of his career, and this is one of his legacy issues. So with the governor and the head of corrections and the cabinet, we've got a very positive point in history here that we're going to do something good on this stuff. We're going to do it now. You'll also see up there representatives from the community-based reentry coalitions. So as we move ahead, and I won't make any assumptions, but I hope today works well, and we end up, by the end of the day, having a decision to support this approach. When we get that steering team from this 2-parish region formed, we're going to have 3 leaders of that team. And one of those 3 leaders, one from parole, one represent the jails, but right in the middle of that is the presiding co-chair that represents the community. Could be a faith leader, a civic leader, somebody's pretty well known, just, doing good work for the sake of doing this work. That community co-chair sits on the state team. And right now we've got those first 5 parishes seated. And as we start to work with the next group of parishes, they'll be seated up there as well. That guarantees that the communities have input to what happens at the state level. And when we consider the LA-PRI and the association that Bonnie's bringing to life, you can imagine that before we get to these state meetings, we might want to do a little networking with the other parishes to make sure that whatever we can agree on that we go into solidified in the meeting around policy improvement, funding, etc., that we link arms. The state, the governor, the legislature is much more prone to listen to 10 parishes than they are to 1. They're a whole lot more prone to listen to those first 5 perhaps than those second 7. But these 12, 13 parishes we're talking about, they don't just represent 70% of the people coming back from prison. They represent the majority of the people in the legislature. That means that we got the power of politics. And the only folks that can successfully lobby in the legislature to improve what we're doing in the justice system are y'all sitting in this room. It isn't the Department of Corrections. They're not good lobbyists. They hear that they just want more state dollars. So we got to create, through these coalitions, education, understanding, a local comprehensive plan. We'll talk about that this afternoon. How many people getting out? What are the risk levels? What are we going to do with them as a group? All 10 parishes that we're working with right now, there's 10 active out of that 13. Join forces. Be here. Right up there on the right, on this side of the screen, is where we focus on this individual case planning that has to be done. So there's committees doing this work. We got full-blown policy, we got procedures, we got a flow chart as to the way the case is supposed to go. It is as sophisticated as any place I've ever worked in the country. And we're just getting ready now in 2018 to be able to launch that. Any questions about that state group? So far, so good. Makes sense? I take that affirmation to heart. Looks similar. This is the local group. So just behind the curtain up there, you've got the Department of Corrections. You see these dotted lines from the Department of Corrections down to the coalition and down to the steering team. That dotted line means it's an informal relationship. The coalition does not work for the Department of Corrections. The steering team does not work for the Department of Corrections. You work for the community. This is your authority here. Just like there is a Reentry Advisory Council at the state level, here there is this local coalition. Again, large group. Can't have too many people. No such thing. 50, 60, 80, 100. I've been in some large urban centers where it gets up to be 800, 900 people. Little big crowd. They're not meeting all the time, but when they have an event and they got 200, 300 people showing up and they're doing public speaking and education and looking at the numbers and evaluating, looking at the evaluations and whatnot, people take notice of that. Politicians take notice of that. But, again, importantly, below that is the group that does the work. We'll be talking about this afternoon. That is the steering team. Those representatives there look very similar to what we saw at the state level. We need people there that are experts in employment, experts in housing, subject matter experts, behavioral health, substance abuse, mental health, family and children's welfare, alcohol, drug addiction, representatives for legal services, U.S. Attorney. We have a U.S. Attorney rep in the room. We had one at the last session we had. Obviously, law enforcement here in big numbers today. And I'll tell you, in all the states I've worked, law enforcement is some of the biggest supporters we have. Why? They want to know who's getting out and when, and they want them to have a plan. And they want to know everybody. Now, we talk about low, moderate, high risk. Law enforcement wants to know also about this very high-risk group. Because these are the ones we need to tail them, nail them, and jail them. These are career criminals. I'm sorry there's so many of you in uniform. I probably shouldn't have done it that way, but sorry. But that's really evident everywhere we work. Law enforcement supports the work. Faith-based organizations, community-based nonprofits, victims advocates, successful former prisoners. I'll tell you one thing about the research. If you sit down with a group of people that spent time in prison, successful, unsuccessful for that matter, and you said to that group, spend an hour and list out the things that helped you become successful, or list out the things that if you had had it, you would have been successful, put that on a list, and then you took that list and you compared it to the research, guess what? It matches right up. That's why we have to have formerly incarcerated people at the table, those that have been successful, so we can understand their perspective and listen to them and give them a strong voice. We've had a lot of support from that across the country. Mention those three co-chairs, prisoner or jail rep, in this case a local jail rep, one of the three co-chairs, parole representative, and then this community representative that's the presiding co-chair. And they have a transition team that's a group of people, a smaller group than this, several people. They're just going to make sure that they're clear when these men and women eventually get moved closer to home, that interaction occurs. Access, development of this reentry plan, the reentry accountability plan, that's the transition team, that's what they do. And importantly, you see that circle up at the top right corner there, the community coordinator. You can't do this work very well without support staff. Every jurisdiction, we're committed to making certain they've got at least enough money to put somebody under contract to manage this work. This steering team here, if we rely just on volunteers, it would be very difficult to keep that together. particularly when they start generating applications for funding and reentry plans and that type of stuff. You've got to have some level of funding. And we're working now with LA-PRI and the other parishes in the state to get ready for what we expect to happen with some funding being made available as a result of that justice reinvestment stuff. We've been hearing that $16.5 million has been downgraded as of 3 days ago to probably more like $9 million for reasons I won't get into, but it's math more than anything. We're actually going to spend $16.5 million less this year housing those state prisoners in jails, but because that fund wasn't fully funded, not all of it is savings. Some of it is cost avoidance. Because every year they supplement that fund at the end of the year, and we don't know, we don't think they're going to do that this year. So that's what that local structure looks like. This picture tells that story I'm talking about earlier about the sweet spot. You got your low risk, moderate to low, moderate to high, higher risk over here. That's the sweet spot. Extreme high risk, those in the back, tail nail jail. And that's how we end up affecting the recidivism rate across the board. So I want to switch screens in a minute. I want to show you some data, but let me stop there. So questions or comments about what I've talked about so far, particularly that, let me switch back to that screen with the local team. Right there. Does this make sense? Questions or comments about this? How many folks here, from what you've heard so far, are leaning toward supporting this type of thing, if I can show hands? Leaning toward supporting it. That's great. How many folks need to know more information? I'm going to move you over to the high risk. What I was saying earlier about compliance, in the case, you're going to go sit over.
How do you determine, and I guess DOC does it, who's going to determine and what's the protocols to determine who's low, medium, high?
Oh, good. That's a great question. That's a great question. I feel better about you already.
Let's hope.
So there's something called risk and need assessment instrument. And what that risk need assessment instrument does is it gathers information about thousands and thousands and thousands of prisoners, and we look at the ones that made it, the ones that didn't, and we find correlations between their characteristics of who made it and who didn't. This is what we find. These are the kinds of things that separate this group that you were in until a minute ago to this group over to this group. And what we want to do is we want to make sure what this instrumentation does is it gives people scores. When you consider risk, in the weeds a little bit here, but it's a weedy question, so I'll give you a weedy answer. How are we doing on time?
We have 12 minutes.
12 minutes, good. When we consider risk, there's stuff that people can't change about their history. It's called static. And that is, how old were you when you committed your first offense? What was that first offense? How many violent felonies have you committed? How many times you've been in prison? How many times you've been returned to prison? What's your record of violation and noncompliance? Those are static factors. Historically, that was the only way they defined risk. That meant that you were in a risk level, you could never get out of it. But the science became more sophisticated and realized, look, there's stuff that you can do in your life that will reduce your propensity for criminal activity. You quit hanging around with the wrong crowd, antisocial peers. You start thinking more clearly about your ability to be successful. You move away from criminal thinking. You enter into educational employment programs. You join a church, a synagogue, a temple. These are positive social engagements, which also then help assess risk. So if I got a group of folks here that are moderate risk, particularly these folks down here on the lower end, as they're successful in engaging in these type of pro-social activities, we're very likely to see their risk level change. So what we do is we apply this instrument called the Tiger. And it was developed by one of these universities in the state. I'm not sure which one. That's funny, y'all. Well, sometimes it's funny. And they are showing this very strong ability to produce risk. This is what the old risk instrument was able to do. Predicted successfully about 62% of the time. The new one is upwards of 78. Now, a flip of the coin is 50-50. So my point here is that these are pretty sophisticated tools, and we're getting a lot better at it. Other questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on the planning. You know, at a free school, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail.
Yeah, sir.
But my thing is, that how much emphasis does the ReEntry program have on helping convicted felons, like, you know, getting a job, getting back into the workforce? Because I know so many of them that can't find a job.
Yeah, it is the premium issue. It is the primary issue. Now, in this work, we're not working with people that haven't been to prison. So you got a whole bunch of people convicted of felonies, sitting on probation, a bunch of people sitting in the jail. This isn't for them. This is just people been out of prison. But still, the point is correct. And what we're doing in the other jurisdictions, some of which have been doing this work now for 2 years, is we're bringing together groups of employers. We're raising some dollars to make sure that those employers have got what they need to be able to have the ability to go into the jails where we're going to house these people, interview these men, mostly men, and make sure that while they're in the jail that they're getting the type of programming they need to make good employees. In fact, we're doing a session tomorrow. It's called Ready for Work. And we've got about 30 employers who are coming to this meeting, and they're going to hear what we're attempting to do, be able to get this done. It's a very dedicated effort, and it's very specific to that sweet spot of people that are coming through. But the key to it is making sure we've got them in a position, the men coming back, particularly the men, mostly men, again, I want to ignore the women, heaven forbid, but the women are such smaller numbers and it's a more difficult process because of where they're housed. It's so very, very far away. But with the men, make sure that they're getting what they need before they're released to make them more attractive to employers, and make sure that when we're doing education in the community, the work we're doing with the employers is paramount. Other questions, Cam? We got time for probably one more. I'm going to ask you all a question.
I would just like to share, as my agency, I'm with the Business and Career Solutions Center.
Wonderful.
We represent Region 3, which is Lafourche, Terrebonne, and Assumption, and our agency, as a partner, are one of the resources that we will provide. We help those individuals that are returning from prison. We help them with finding jobs. We have employers that we currently work with that will hire those offenders, so that's where our agency would come in.
Perfect. I'm so glad you stood up and said that, because remember earlier on I said, we've already been doing this work and we have assets. That's an asset. When we say to the state we want some more money, we say to the feds we want some more money, we're going to tell them we're going to add that to the money we're already using and spending, and we got to make sure that her agency has got access to these moderate to high risk people before they're released, so some of the slots she has can be used for them. Because if we don't hook her agency up with them, guess who's going to be filming? These are the ones that are going to be showing up at the tape, at least 4 and 5. All right? Now I got a question for y'all. I'm going to ask you to give me some sign here If you're ready to support this initiative and move to the next step, I want you to give me a thumb up. If you're not, give me a thumb down. And if you still need more information, shake your thumb sideways. Thumb up, thumb down, sideways shake. He's still shaking his thumb over there. Let's see the thumbs up. Let's see the thumbs down. Not a one. And the shaky thumbs. 2, 3, 4, 5. Are you shaking? No. Take you fishing. Do that again. All right, so those of you that got the shaky thing, we're going to bring you along. Come to the second meeting, we'll have a little more information. No reason you should be convinced after 35 minutes, all right? But this is non-controversial. There's not a whole lot of downside. Yeah?
I think this is a wonderful program, and I have mentioned this many times, as our sheriff can say. I've mentioned this to him many times, that this is a program that we've needed for years.
Good.
And now we're going to have it. And I think we're going to not have as many people re-entering prison if we do what this program says.
Well, thank you for that endorsement. That's a good note to end this on. It sounds to me like you're ready to help us and join this coalition. Yes, ma'am?
I'd be interested to know what this group is interested in so far as housing for people once they're out.
What the group is interested in?
Or
Or what, you mean the prison?
the prison, yes.
Yeah, so most prisoners, upon release, are going to go back and live with their families, and that's only going to last so long. Some of them come back homeless, particularly in the larger urban centers. This is a huge issue to try to address. That's one of the reasons we got the executive director of the Louisiana Housing Authority on the state board, that state team. We got to work with her to get more resources. This is a place where it's not that many assets because there aren't many slots available, but we need to be able to invest in more. And I don't want to put a silver lining on it. It's going to be a tough one. Yeah.
I know it's tough because I started a nonprofit. Provide housing for people, and it's extremely tough.
It's very, very tough.
I didn't have the resources I need to continue.
I don't know any other state in the United States that doesn't put any state dollars into public housing. We used to put $214 million a year in housing using state dollars. That fund evaporated and never came back. One of the few places we're just completely relying on federal funds. I want to get into all the revenue structure that is so damaged in the state. But at the end of the day, you're going to do this work with this particular group of people. You got to be very dedicated about it. It's a long-term effort. Yes, sir.
I want to echo that. I think that's your most important, one of your most important, I didn't see it on your board, is environment. You're going to plop these people back in the same area where they came out of, where they lived a life of crime. You're almost dooming them to failure. Environmental factors are probably the most important thing, especially everybody on that half side of the road.
Well, and you're right about that. I wouldn't argue with that point, but I'll tell you what the research tells us is the single most important thing that differentiates people who succeed from people who don't succeed, and it isn't housing, it's family support. Which actually is kind of counterintuitive to this issue about them going back to the same place. When they go back home, they're going back to that neighborhood, and what we got to make sure of is that those pressures that are happening in that neighborhood, these guys got to be too busy to be able to succumb to that. I was in a meeting and somebody said, we need to relocate them. We need to relocate them. We need to put them someplace else. I said, well, you're getting out of prison. You want to go home.
Yeah.
You want to go back to your family. We're not going to do like the Trail of Tears here, right? But if somebody is motivated to find better housing, particularly when it's related to jobs, it's very difficult to decide which more important, housing or jobs. So don't call it housing jobs. It's married. You got to have both of them.
I get it, but is there like a transition? You can't
Well,
go straight
yeah.
from jail to high crime area.
In many states, there is a greater transition than there is here. But here we hope to see a transition from wherever they're housed for most of their term, to move closer to a parish jail setting here, right? And that's going to be the transition. Other places have got hundreds and hundreds of slots in halfway houses. We've got to have to do, we're going to have to do more of that, but revenue is tough. That's why we're going to have to rely somewhat on some federal dollars and on some philanthropy dollars. And remember, we're not working with you know, thousands of people. We're working with a smaller group than everybody who's getting out, and then only some of them. I'm going to show you some of the numbers at the next meeting because we've run out of time. So let me thank you. We're going to take a 10-15 minute break. There's refreshments out this way. Grab some refreshments. Come on back, and we're going to be joined with some of the folks from Lafourche.